I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote lunch speaker, Vernon Smith. Vernon Smith is the George L. Argyros Chair in Finance and Economics at Chapman University and President of the International Foundation for Research in Experimental Economics. In 2002, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for having established laboratory experiments as a tool in experimental economic analysis, especially in the study of alternative market mechanisms. He has held appointments at very many universities, I think Purdue, Stanford, Brown, little schools like that, before he ended up in California at Chapman. He has a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Caltech, master's in economics from the University of Kansas, and his PhD in economics from Harvard. He's authored more articles than any of us can count, and I'm really looking forward to a new book by Vernon with his co-author Bart, I think it's with Bart, called Humanomics. That'll be forthcoming with Cambridge Press in just a few months. Please welcome Vernon Smith.
I want to hark back to the first speaker, Jim Otteson, who spoke of luck. I want to suggest that everyone in this room is really very lucky. You were either born in the United States or you chose to come here. And I want to welcome those who chose to come here. I'm also lucky in another way. All the speakers have spoken of their great pleasure to be here. At my age, it's a pleasure to be anywhere. But I add to that pleasure, this conference topic, I love it. I began my career fairly early as an experimental economist, although I didn't know that's what I was doing. I finished at Harvard in 1955, and my first position was at Purdue University. And I taught principles of economics. And I realized that I knew nothing about the relationship between economic theory, supply and demand, and what people do on the ground. And so I had this idea for doing a classroom experiment the following semester at the beginning. And so I had, and you understand, all of us in those days believed, thought, and taught that the competitive equilibria were very abstract, ideal situations, that a market could only reach that competitive state if everyone in the market had complete information on supply and demand. Well, I believed that. After all of the great professors said it was true, and all the pretty books said it was true. So in January 1956, I gave half my class, I made buyers, and I assigned them values. The other half, I made sellers, and I assigned them costs. The values, arrayed from highest to lowest, were demand. The costs, arrayed from lowest to highest, was the supply. No one in the room knew anything about supply and demand and knew nothing about what the supply and demand in that market was. They only had their own little fragment of it. And I organized that market as an open outcry double auction, okay? And it converged very quick. I repeated the experiment, series of trading periods. It converged very quickly to the competitive equilibrium. I thought there was something wrong with the experiment. And then I realized, yes, too much symmetry in the design. I need to take a very asymmetric case, one in which buyers got very little of the surplus and sellers got a lot of it. I did that experiment. It converged. Every experiment I did converged. People on the ground, they don't even know what they know or are capable of doing, okay? And this was a beautiful example of course, Adam Smith's major theorem, that as no part of their attention, their intentions, each seeking to better his own position betters everybody. So these markets were all 100% efficiency. That got me hooked, and I became an experimental economist, okay? All right, I want to, let's see if I can figure that.
I think maybe just push.
Oh, here's one, okay. So I want to talk about, return to Adam Smith today to talk about some experiments that we can understand why people are doing what they're doing in those experiments from reading Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. You can't understand it by reading modern economic theory. So I want to give you a little introduction to Adam Smith, and then I want to show you some simple trust game experiments. Well, Smith wrote 3 books. He wrote the history of astronomy. It was published posthumously. He died in 1790, and it was not published until 1795. He wrote the theory of moral sentiments in 1759, and then he wrote a book that buried most of the books published in the 18th century. He wrote The Wealth of Nations, which became enormously important and popular. Enormously important, is that better? An enormously important and popular book. I mean, statesmen read it. William Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister of Britain for over 17 years, knew the book thoroughly. I mean, statesmen were very, very well informed. You say, what a difference it is today. Now, all 3 books are concerned with rules and order in the universe, in human social conduct, and in jurisprudence and economy. And the theme I see threading its way through all 3 of these books is that all science is concerned with discovering the invisible forces of nature, sociality, and economy. And of course, the figure of Isaac Newton cast a long shadow into the 18th century. He died in 1727. I can remember that date because I was born in 1927 on the 200th anniversary of Newton's death. Also, Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs in 1927. The invisible forces that were prominent in Newton's theory was this the invisible force of gravity. And the reason why, on the top line, that history of astronomy, I say it was written before 1757, we know that because Adam Smith in that paper said that the followers of Newton have predicted the arrival of a certain comet in 1757. Footnote. And Smith says the comet arrived agreeable to the prediction. It's Halley's Comet. Incredible that these invisible forces that Newton had discovered could account for the arrival of a heavenly body And just imagine what effect that would have, you see, to 18th century people. So here you have an enormously successful research program with Isaac Newton, and I see the Scottish Enlightenment, Hume and Smith and the other participants in that Scottish Enlightenment as applying the notion, what are the invisible forces at work that makes us sociable and that drives our economy. So I see that as the research program that came out of that. Now, the theory of moral sentiments has a subtitle that kind of tells you very easily what it's all about. It's an essay towards an analysis of the principles by which men naturally judge concerning the conduct and character first of their neighbors and afterwards of themselves. It's all about coming to see ourselves as others see us, as the great Scottish poet from that time said. Okay, here, Smith's fundamental axiom was self-interest. And today in economics we'd call that non-satiation. More is better, less is worse. And moreover, fundamental in his system is the notion that that's common knowledge, meaning we all know that. For each, more is beneficial, less is hurtful. But in the process of our maturation, of becoming social, quote, we humble the arrogance of our self-love to bring it down to what others will go along with. That's the message, the prominent message in the theory of moral sentiments. It's all about rules and order, and it's not because we're not self-interested. Okay? And then in our maturation, we each learn to follow rules that motivate us to reward intentional actions that benefit us and punish intentional actions that hurt us. Now, you see, knowledge that all of us are self-interested is what enables us to know right away that if I take an action, who benefits and who hurts, because the ones that benefits get more, the ones that are hurt get less, you see. So there's no conflict here between getting along with our neighbors and being social and being self-interested, and in fact, being self-interested drives all of that. It's an input to the rules we use. It's a necessary input. And another important concept in Smith is that circumstances, and in the games I'm going to show you, that includes the payoffs of the individuals in the games. Circumstances allow intentions to be conveyed in actions. They're signals to be sent and read by others in what you might think of as a conversation, even though there's no verbal expression of it. But rule following, this learning to follow these rules, needn't be a deliberate self-aware process. And Smith says we all begin that around age 5 when we first are going to school or have playfellows. And we soon learn that our playfellows are not as indulgent as our parents. They don't like it when we do things that hurt them, and they just love it when we do things that benefit them. And we start to learn, you see, in what Adam Smith called the great school of self-command. Self-command is an important part of this of what it's all about. So analysis and sentiments involves benefit or hurt, and inference of intentions, imagining others' role, and self-command. That's really the whole picture. And self-command is important as a way of controlling the temptation to serve yourself only. Okay, now here is a baseline game that I want to talk to you about. We first ran a game like this in 1989, and we were baffled. You could not understand this at all in terms of the notion of maximizing your own payoff or your own utility. No way. And interesting that you can, this game's been replicated with a little higher payoffs 25 years later. We get the same results. This seems, and people have done them in between. This seems to be very stable. And I'm talking here about U.S. Citizens, young people. Okay, in this game, imagine that you have been invited to our laboratory at Chapman University, and you get $5 for showing, or $7 now, I'm sorry, for showing up on time. You're going to participate in an experiment, and whatever you earn will be paid to you in cash as you leave, privately. Each person is paid privately and individually. You sit down and read the instructions of this game. You are anonymously matched with someone else in the room. For example, maybe there's 12 people. You are anonymously matched with one of the other 11 people. At random, you will be person 1 or 2. You will play the game exactly once, and as you leave, you'll be paid. So why do we make that so austere and so make it so private and everything? We want to give this person the best, we want to give this notion that people act in their own interest its best shot. And that's what we're doing here. We also do these games repeated in other ways. But in this particular game, you're given that. So it's all the more striking kind of what the results that we get. Now, notice that if person 1 moves right, person 1 gets $12 and 2 gets $12 and the game ends. If 1 passes to 2, 2 can either move right or down. If they move right, person 1 gets $18, person 2 gets $30. Or 2 can move down, 1 gets $6 and 2 gets $42. The standard model in economics says that if you're only going to play this game once and you're person number 1, you don't want to move down. You want to move right. So right is the equilibrium of the game for people that are strictly all self-interested and use that principle in their decision-making. You see, which is the important additional point that Smith makes. Well, the first time we ran this game in 1989, we had half the people move down, half right, and of the half that moved down, the 2s, 2/3 moved right for the 1830, and 1/3 moved down. Okay, that was all those many years ago. Okay, here's a proposition from Adam Smith that explains behavior in this game. If you do something good, and I'm not giving you the King's English, I'm giving you mine. If you do something good for me because you wanted to do it, I feel required to do something good for you that is proportioned to the gratitude I feel, because such actions alone are the approved objects of gratitude. And by approved objects of gratitude, he's talking about the social community, okay? Anyone watching this would have the same notion of what kind of feelings you should have if someone did something intentionally that didn't have to do it, intentionally good for you. Well, in this, we ran 49 pairs. Okay, 55% of them moved down, 45% of them move right, and of the persons, two, that have an opportunity move, we get 2/3 cooperating and 1/3 defecting. So this proposition does a really nice way of organizing and telling you how to think about this game, okay? Now, Smith's proposition was completely general. It's a property of people and of the rules that they play by. He wasn't thinking of this kind of a game, but 250 years ago, we see how relevant it is to what happens. Now, because people are randomly assigned positions between 1 and 2, that means that if one had been assigned to position 2, he would have played, on average, you would expect that person to play right, to be cooperatively, okay? But notice that fewer people are playing down from position 1 than are playing down from position 2. Well, the explanation is very simple. 2 knows what kind of a person 1 is. 1 has revealed it. Whereas 1s are uncertain about that, you see. Even if they were in the position 2 and would cooperate, 1 cannot be sure that he or she is matched with a like person. Okay, so only 55% play down. So the difference, 12%, we can explain what's included in that 12% from the wisdom of Beneficence Proposition 1. By the way, Smith doesn't call it Beneficence Proposition 1. He just states it on page 78, but it's a short statement. When he makes a short statement, read it again. Read it again. He's summarizing. He was putting a lot of wisdom into that, okay? And okay, here's Beneficence Proposition 2. Action that does good for another must be free. It cannot be extorted. Want of such good action exposes to no resentment and punishment, because the mere want of good action does no real positive evil. So in the trust game, if one decides to not cooperate, play the equilibrium, suppose we require him to pass to 2, and 2 now chooses that equilibrium of the game, or punishes. He can punish him if he wants to. Here's the game. It's the same as the game before, okay? Except now, to get to the equilibrium, 12-12, 1 passes play first to 2, and 2, if 2 doesn't like that, at a cost of $2 to himself, he can honk his horn in protest of that person. Like the people who jump the queue when cars are lined up getting in because the lanes are narrowing. And one goes around them, you hear honks of protests. Well, here's the results. Not a single case, not one single person, 2, felt motivated to punish 1 for not cooperating with her. Okay? We first ran 25 pairs, and we got no one punishing, and I told my co-author, Bart Wilson, I said, this is incredible. All theories have error. Theories never can predict 100%. Let's run some more cases. So we ran 13 more. We just didn't get any, so that's it. Ladies and gentlemen, no one is prepared to punish failure to be beneficent. You have a right to pass on that option. Okay? But notice, action in the rest of the game is affected by what one did. Compare the game on the left with the one on the right. On the left, we have 55% playing down. On the right, we have only 39% playing down. Oh, good thing, because notice the defection to $642 playing down by 2 is much greater in the right hand than in the left hand. So Adam Smith emphasizes over and over again the importance of context. Context is necessary for all of us to read situations to know what to do. And it's coming up very strongly in these games. You can't add a node. You can't add a node with how people look at the whole situation. So now you see the game on the left, if one moves down, there's no ambiguity at all. He didn't have to do it. And he's made himself completely vulnerable to defection by 2. Whereas on the right, you see, it's qualified. Did the person move down because he trusts me or because he's afraid of getting punished on the right if he went right? What's this, you know? So people have a richer situation to analyze. Okay, now Justice Proposition 1. If you do something, and this is the obverse of the beneficence proposition, if you do something bad to me because you wanted to do it, your action seems alone to deserve, Smith says, call aloud, for punishment, proportion to the resentment I feel, because such actions alone are the approved objects of resentment. Okay, so we're going to give person 1 who plays down now an opportunity to punish if 2 doesn't play right. And here's the game. The top part of it is just the same, but notice now if 2 plays down, 1 can choose this defect option that we saw in the baseline game, or 1, at a cost of only $2 to himself, can punish the other person, reducing the payoff from 42 to only 4. Well, here are the results. We ran 81 pairs. Notice that we're getting more people moving down than in the baseline game. Well, you see, now they're thinking, oh, this person is more likely to cooperate because I can come back and punish him if he doesn't. So I'm holding this. So I'm more comfortable moving down, you see, in the game on the right than on the left. But it backfires because, you see, one signal of trust is now mixed with this threat of punishment. And so you get a change in behavior on the lower part of the game, you see, because of that. And I'm just giving you, you see, how you would talk about this game from Smith's perspective. Because the neat thing about his model of human sociality is it enables us to kind of conjecture, have a pretty good idea about people, on why people are changing as we add nodes and what's might be going on. Okay, so what does Adam Smith say about justice versus beneficence? He says, beneficence is less essential to the existence of society than justice. Society may subsist, though not in the most comfortable state, without beneficence, but the prevalence of injustice must utterly destroy it. Nature, therefore, and nature, remember, that's you and me learning to live with each other and devising rules and not even hardly realizing that we are hammering out rules. Nature, therefore, exhorts mankind to acts of beneficence by the pleasing consciousness of deserved reward. She has not thought it necessary to guard and enforce the practice of it by the errors of merited punishment in case it should be neglected. It is the ornament which embellishes, not the foundation which supports the building, and therefore sufficient to recommend, but by no means necessary to impose. So justice, he says, is on the contrary the main pillar that upholds the whole edifice. Now, in sentiments, Justice Proposition 1 is the key to the origin of property. Common feelings of resentment toward improperly motivated, that is, intentionally hurtful actions within close-knit communities is the origin of the civil order of law and of punishment proportioned to resentment. So Adam Smith is saying long before there were civil states, before there was civil government, long before that, people were already well practiced in the rules that make for order and the rules that make for disorder. And so when they come to create civil governments, it was very natural to move those same rules into what we now call the rule of law. So the rule of law is not coming from the Constitution, it's not coming from the legislature, it's not coming from the president, it's coming from you and me in our ancient associations. And he goes on to say, as the greater and more irreparable the evil that is done, the resentment of the sufferer runs naturally the higher. Sentiments combines this proposition, with the asymmetry between gains and losses to explain differential penalties applied to loss of property under law in nation states. Now, what's the asymmetry between gains and losses? Well, the co-winner of the Nobel Prize in 2002 was my good friend Danny Kahneman, a psychologist. And I think one of the most important contributions that Danny made, of the many, but one of the most important was to document that how much that gains, increases in our states are much less, much larger, less prominent in our feelings than declines. We want to avoid losses in a way that's not symmetric. The way the way we seek gains is the basic message in that. And he did this in a wide range of experiments, established that. Well, Adam Smith was actually quite articulate on that proposition in 1759, and I think and of course that had no influence on psychology, none on economics. The theory of moral sentiments, you see, basically faded out of existence. But he was very good on this principle. And so here's the way he makes use of that. He says, to be deprived of that which we are possessed of is a greater evil than to be disappointed of what we have only the expectation. Breach of property, therefore, theft and robbery, which take from us what we are possessed of, are greater crimes than breach of contract, which only disappoints us of what we expected. The sacred laws of justice, therefore, those whose violation seems to call loudest for vengeance and punishment, are the laws which guard the life and person of our neighbor. The next are those which guard his property and his possessions. And last of all come those who guard what are called his personal rights, or what is due to him from the promises of others. So he explains why it is, basically, that theft and robbery are criminal offenses. Violation of contract is only a civil offense. You are justified in seeking remuneration if there's been a breach in that, but it's not criminal. It's less important in that sense. So Smith gets really quite a bit of big picture themes you see out of a lot of these elementary propositions. Now, property rights are necessary but not sufficient in wealth of nations for wealth creation. Smith adds a sufficient condition, what I have in several papers called his axiom of discovery. Quote, the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. Now, exchange is an expression of human sociality and really follows from his Beneficence Proposition 1, which applies to strangers once we have third-party enforcement of property. And we become less dependent then on trust. You see, in the game I described to you, in a lot of our day-to-day relationships where we trade favors, there's a lapsed time between the giving and the receiving. And that's what Beneficence Proposition 1, I think I was primarily applied to in sociality. But we come to exchange, you see, there's a mutual simultaneous trade that goes on in which I both benefit you, you feel gratitude for that, you benefit me, and I feel gratitude for that, and it's built simultaneously into the exchange. And if you have third-party enforcement of property, it's very natural now for this to extend to all of our economic transactions. So the wealth of nations defines a discovery process. First, there's an exchange. That means there's a price. And even if the price is not public, people find out about it by gossip, okay? People are in touch with each other on things like that. So here's an exchange, there's a price. Prices facilitate comparisons. I'm a farmer. Now I find I grow both corn and hogs. I find that there's for my subsistence use, I find now there's a price out there for corn and hogs. So I can produce hogs either by producing corn and trading them for hogs, or I can produce them on my farm. I can now begin to make calculations and think about that a little more carefully once there's a price, you see. And the main point, I think, in Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, about specialization growing out of exchange, is that it allows people to discover specialization. It's not out there waiting to be found. It has to be created, okay, by actions that people take from the prices that they're learning about in markets. So this is out of classical economics, Smith is. And I think what we found in neoclassical economics that I was primarily brought up with is that we too eagerly abandoned the equilibrating process kind of discussions that you found in The Wealth of Nations. Okay, here's the foundations of classical liberalism as I see it, from going at it from Smith. And there's three parts. There's justice, beneficence, and self-command. Justice is achieved by limiting and controlling injustice. Forbidden, hurtful actions are based on experience and consent. They're backward-looking. They're based upon the wisdom of our experience. Actions not specifically forbidden as violations of fair play, in other words, fouls, are permitted, allowing wide space for discovery and innovation. So imagine a playing field. You're free to move anywhere in that playing field as long as you don't commit any fouls. If you commit a foul, that's not acceptable, and that's punished. So you are constrained your freedom of choice is you see, delimited only by these forbidden things. Otherwise, you're free to choose. So that, in a way, there's this finite number of things that are fouls that you can be punished for, and then there's these infinite possibilities out there to explore. I see that as an important part of Smith's vision, you see, which helped to define what we mean by classical liberalism. Beneficence undergirds social reciprocity when combined with justice, and third-party enforcement of property supports trade. Trade, specialization, and wealth across all cultures and nations. And of course, the history of the world, particularly since the 17th, 18th century, has been a gradual expansion, you see, of world trade to more and more remote areas. But self-command is the ultimate regulator. Power corrupts. Politicians, police, clergy, everybody, all of us are vulnerable, okay, because of the corruptions of power. And that leaves open the question, who's to guard the guardians if we're all corruptible? Well, I think that's where self-command ultimately comes in. It's up to us to take the actions to delimit evil. Okay, thank you. And these two pieces are the ones that I've primarily drawn on here in this talk. Thank you very much.
We do have time for some questions for Dr. Smith. I don't know that we have microphones out here, so please speak. Oh, we do. Yes, this gentleman here will take care of that. So if you have questions, we'll take those now.
I found it interesting that you chose to talk in two books that were 250 years old. So obviously your holism is very important.
Well, I, as a graduate student at the University of Kansas, where I got a master's degree, I read The Wealth of Nations. I recently looked at my notes in that course, which are in Duke University Library archives, and there's just to make sure, because I don't ever remember anyone mentioning the theory of moral sentiments. Adam Smith never cites himself. He writes The Wealth of Nations and never cites the theory of moral sentiments, okay? That's not good form. Today, of course, the first people we cite is ourselves. And, well, I have long been involved in Liberty Fund colloquia. And more than anything, I owe an enormous debt to the Liberty Fund for exposing me to the theory of moral sentiments, his first book, and other literature by Adam Smith. About the first time I cited the theory of moral sentiments was in my Southern Economics Association lecture, which I think was about 1992. I cited, but I go back and read that and I realize I didn't really understand it. You gotta read the theory of moral sentiments much more careful. For one thing, the wisdom is scattered through it. It's all, see, I've collected a lot of this stuff in one place for you. You don't find it all in one place that easily in the theory of moral sentiments. But it's there, and it's very logical and well-structured and deeply based upon observation. The guy was incredible in terms of the insights he got out of just watching and listening and observing people. Well, as a result of this I got into more deeply examining this first book, and I realized, after several times through it, that these propositions applied to those games that we did, and there were a bunch of them in the ultimatum games and trust games in the 1880s and 90s that have led to a huge literature in which people are struggling, you see, to explain the behavior in those games. There is no explanation better than the one in Adam Smith, written 250 years ago. Now that's impressive. You've got to believe he was onto something, and onto something really important, when he can explain what people are doing here 250 years later in these simple games, using his propositions which were intended to be kind of much broader generalizations, you see, as to what it is we learn in our maturation, and how it is we are able to get along effectively with our neighbors and still be self-interested.
I wanted to quickly ask, do you have any current book recommendations other than...
What's that?
Would you have any other book recommendations other than Adam Smith's literature? Any other book recommendations?
Anything else to recommend? But besides the theory of moral sentiments, is that the point? Well, I think there's been a lot of new work on Adam Smith that has been coming on in the last 10 years. The Liberty Fund is now creating kind of a major portal for people that are interested in Adam Smith, including a scholars portal, because scholarship on Adam Smith has increased very substantially, and much of it quite independent and different than what I'm telling you about in the experiments. You see, this, in fact, Nick Phillipson, he was one of the biographers of Adam Smith. He heard me speak on these things a few years ago, and he came up afterwards. He said, "Vernon, you know," I said, I don't know of anyone else among the Adam Smith scholars have ever made the particular points you made. And I said, well, if that's true, it's because I had unanswered questions that other people didn't have. You see, I had these unanswered questions from these games of the 80s and 90s, and I suddenly realized that he had some important answers. And I'm only giving you, in our book, we have 5 chapters on experiments. There's a lot more experiments that we do and report in that book. It'll be out in November, Cambridge University Press. There's a lot more experiments there that you would never have thought to try if you hadn't read the theory of moral sentiments. So it's not only a source of understanding for some games that we didn't understand. It indicates how to design new experiments and do new tests. That makes it very, very powerful, you see. A model that can do that is really impresses people as well it should.
Professor Smith, we're very honored to have you here. I think a great many people, and I would include myself, look out and generally would conclude that markets and the private sector are working reasonably well in our society today, but government is not working very well at all. So the question I would ask is government performing pretty much exactly as Adam Smith and other great thinkers would predict, or do we have some kind of design problem such that we could have much better performing government for the fix?
So far as I can see, it hasn't changed, except instead of calling it mercantilism, we call it crony capitalism. And that's what Adam Smith was talking about, and it was a serious problem in the 18th century. He thought, Adam Smith opposed slavery, colonialism, empire, taxation without representation. You see, he had a very warm audience of colonialists in the United States. And also the founders of the Constitution, Madison, Franklin, Jefferson, all of the early framers would have read Adam Smith. Many of them would have read the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and not only the Wealth of Nations, because Smith had such a powerful influence at that time, you see, in the 18th, early part of the 19th century. I don't see, it's bigger now than it was then, but the economy's bigger, everything's bigger, and we're more productive, you see. And we've learned today in some of the papers the insidious ways by which this can corrupt wealth creation. And it's a real challenge to channel people's natural creative activities into forms which everybody benefits from, and away from these forms that are self-serving, and we've seen them. One of the most dramatic was in the crash, the Great Recession. What did we do? We bailed out the largest banks. Well, and you did. Less known, generally, is that Sheila Bair, over at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, prosecuted or went through about 400 bankruptcies, of bank failures, of small to medium-sized banks. All of those failures were at no cost to the taxpayer, none. In other words, the assets of those banks, together with prepaid deposit insurance, easily covered the liabilities. There is no reason at all to believe that that wasn't true of Citicorp, Bank of America, the large banks, you see. So that bailout was not of the economy. It was a bailout of the stockholders of those companies. And I think we do have a problem in the sense that secretaries of Treasury come from the investment banking industry. That's routine, you see. And it is a problem because the government needs expertise. They need skills. They need the kind of knowledge that investment bankers and others in private sector have. The problem is to get those skills and into government use without the influence. And that's a very hard problem to solve in a representative democracy because, everybody has presumably an equal chance at this government. Okay.
One last question.
In psychology, there's been a tradition of much of this literature is based on experimenting with American college students, and maybe they aren't represented. The catchphrase is that they're weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And the very different test subjects may yield different experimental results. And there are classic psychology experiments reproduced producing surprising and very different outcomes. Is there anything like that?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Oh, yes, the public good games, ultimatum games, trust games, those have been done multiculturally, including the anthropologists have done these games with really all the way from very remote tribes with almost essentially zero integration into markets, up through ones that are more and more integrated into markets, into modern industrialized nations. And one of the things that they were so surprised at is, as you go to the more and more remote areas, people are much more selfish, expressing their self. In the trust game, you pass to them and they take all the money. Okay? And somehow, people have had this vision, you see, of primitive peoples, of being very cooperative and helpful to each other and everything. Well, they weren't. They were brutes. And there's still some of that out there. So in other words, the indications are that markets are a socializing, and they improve other regarding behavior. People are more other regarding the more modern they are. So, okay. And now those experiments are controversial. I kind of don't, they have to run them differently than we run them, of course, in the United States. And they're run in ways that there's much more interaction between the experimenter and the subject in those experiments. It's got a lot of problems. But anyway, for what it's worth, that's the finding.